Welcome to the podcast. I hope you enjoy my stories. Today's episode is Exit Code by James Byron Love. Copyright 2026. All rights reserved. Now let's get into the stark sci-fi story. The Valdris Observatory Collective occupied the top 4 floors of a building that had once been used as a regional taxation authority, and even after years of reconfiguration and equipment installation, the place never quite stopped feeling like what it had been before. The corridors still carried that muted institutional dullness, a kind of exhausted beige that seemed to flatten sound rather than carry it, and the carpet, older than most of the staff, had worn into uneven paths where people walked the same routes day after day without thinking about it. The building was functional in the way neglected things often are, held together not by design, but by repetition and habit. Inside that structure, however, the instruments were something else entirely. The observatory arrays, data stacks, and long-range optical systems had been installed piece by piece over years of funding cycles that never quite aligned. Each upgrade justified separately, each component more advanced than the last. It created a strange dissonance between what the building was and what it contained, as if 2 different levels of technological civilization had been forced to share the same walls. Even the technicians joked, quietly, that the building was embarrassed by what was happening inside it. On the 3rd floor from the top, in a room designated RC7 in official documentation, but called the Fishbowl by everyone who worked there, the end of everything was being documented in real time. The first anomaly had appeared 8 months earlier, though at the time it had not been called an anomaly. It had been logged as HD 441, a mid-sequence star approximately 400 light-years from Earth, and when the system flagged its absence in the survey sweep, the duty officer on shift had marked it as a sensor fault without hesitation. Instrument error was the default assumption in systems like this. It was safer, simpler, and statistically more likely than anything else. The entry had been left that way for several hours before anyone returned to it. 11 days later, another star failed to appear where it should have been. Then another. By the 3rd disappearance, the pattern had already begun to form, though no one at Valdris Collective had said so aloud. It was not just that stars were vanishing. It was the spacing between the events, the consistency of the intervals, the way each absence arrived like a measured step rather than an accident of physics. Every attempt to categorize it under known astrophysical phenomena failed in slightly different ways, and each failure produced a new temporary explanation that lasted just long enough to be replaced. The language in official reports began to shift as a result. At first it was subtle, phrases like instrument drift, survey correction, anomalous occlusion. Later it became more defensive, more elaborate, as if adding complexity could restore control over the interpretation. Eventually, even that broke down, leaving long stretches of text that read like careful avoidance of conclusion rather than analysis. By the time the 7th star disappeared, the collective understanding inside Valdris had become silent rather than uncertain. Elena stood at the observation window that faced the city below and held a ceramic mug that had cooled to room temperature long before she noticed it. The reflection in the glass showed her face layered over the distant movement of Earth's morning traffic, and for a moment it created the impression of someone looking at her from a slightly different version of the same place. She did not move away from it. Below, the city was already in motion, though nothing about that motion suggested awareness. Transit lines carried people between districts. Elevated walkways filled and emptied in steady cycles. Light filtered through cloud cover in a way that made everything feel temporary but uninterrupted. From this height, nothing looked like it was approaching an end. On the public channels, the official explanation continued to repeat itself in slightly adjusted forms depending on region and jurisdiction. The 7 Bloc Council maintained that what was being observed was a rare but natural astrophysical phenomenon, possibly linked to gravitational cascade effects or previously unmodeled dark matter interactions. The terminology changed often enough that it became clear the function of the language was not to explain, but to maintain coherence between institutions that no longer fully trusted each other's conclusions. Elena had stopped engaging with those explanations a long time ago, not in the sense of rejecting them loudly or formally, but in the quieter way that involved no longer needing them to be wrong in order to proceed. Across the room, Richard Moss remained seated at his terminal, posture unchanged from the earlier part of the morning. His focus had not shifted in hours, though the content on his screen had changed repeatedly. What he was working on was not a single model anymore, but a layered reconstruction, something that appeared to take existing observational data and repeatedly reframe it under different interpretive systems. Each iteration seemed to build on the last without discarding it, creating a structure that was becoming harder to describe in conventional terms. At one point, without looking away from the screen, Richard said, "The gaps are too consistent to be noise." No one responded immediately, not because they disagreed, but because the statement itself did not resolve anything. It simply added weight. The door to RC7 opened just before mid-morning cycle, and Donna Reyes entered carrying a sealed folder that had the flat, deliberate appearance of something that had bypassed digital routing entirely. Physical documentation had become rare enough that its presence in a room like this always changed attention levels before anything was read. Donna placed the folder on the central table and kept her hand on it for a moment longer than necessary before withdrawing. She did not look at anyone as she spoke. "This came through secured transit," Donna said. "No digital record attached." Nathan Cole had already been watching the moment she appeared in the doorway. That was normal for him. What changed was the way his attention narrowed once the folder touched the table, as if the object itself had introduced a new variable into an already running calculation. Nathan spoke quietly without looking up. "That means they don't want it traceable through standard routing." Donna did not answer that directly. Instead, she said, "It means they don't want it existing in any system that can be queried later." The room did not react immediately. Not outwardly, but something in the atmosphere shifted in a way that had nothing to do with temperature or sound. Outside the Fishbowl, Erth continued its morning cycle as if nothing had changed. Inside, 4 people remained in the presence of information that had not yet been opened, but had already begun to alter the shape of everything around it. And above them, in places no instrument could correct for once the pattern had fully established itself, the stars continued to disappear with steady, deliberate spacing, as if whatever was removing them had no interest in urgency, only completion. The thing about carrying a secret of that magnitude was that it did not announce itself as anything recognizable at first. It settled in quietly, almost politely, as if it were just another unresolved dataset or another anomaly requiring future verification, and Elena Vasquez allowed it to exist in that form for longer than she would have admitted to anyone else, because institutions like the Valdris Observatory Collective train people to delay interpretation until it became administratively safe to have one. She had seen the pattern on a Tuesday, though even that detail had become unreliable in her memory in the way small anchors of time sometimes do when everything surrounding them stops behaving normally. What she could still reconstruct with clarity was the ordinary structure of that day. He had been preparing for a Wednesday budget meeting she had no interest in attending, rehearsing internally the acceptable language for absence without consequence, when she had returned to a secondary analysis of extinction interval simply because leaving datasets partially reviewed felt like negligence, even when there was no rational justification for additional scrutiny. The first time the pattern resolved itself into something coherent, it did not feel like discovery. It felt like recognition of something that had been present all along, but previously distributed across too many assumptions to be seen in a single frame. The intervals between stellar disappearances were not irregular. They were not statistical noise. They were not artifacts of measurement or calibration error or incomplete sampling. They were consistent in a way that removed randomness from consideration entirely. Consistency of that scale did not belong to natural systems. Lena Vasquez sat with that realization long enough for the system logs to time out on their own. The screen dimmed slightly in response to inactivity, casting her reflection back at her with a faint delay that made it look like she was watching herself arrive at the conclusion rather than forming it in real time. Nothing around her reacted. The institution did not respond. The building did not acknowledge that anything had changed. The only thing that had changed was that the data could no longer be interpreted in good faith as anything other than sequence. When she reopened the analysis, the result remained unchanged, which was worse than contradiction would have been, because contradiction at least would have provided an exit into uncertainty. Instead, every recalculation reinforced the same structure. Each disappearance of a star aligned with the next in a spacing that held steady across time in a way that suggested design rather than drift. Elena closed the system and sat back from the terminal without moving her hands from the edge of the desk, as if physical contact with the workstation was still necessary to keep the conclusion contained. For a while she simply remained there, listening to the ambient noise of the observatory systems running their background cycles, the quiet mechanical persistence of an institution that had no awareness of what it was sitting on top of. What she understood, eventually, was not just that something was happening, but that the classification of what was happening had already failed. The language they had was built to describe events inside a universe that did not behave like this. If the pattern was communication, then it implied an intelligence that did not need proximity, visibility, or even continuity in any form that human observation could reliably capture. It implied agency operating at a scale that made every known framework of explanation feel provincial. She did not speak about it, not to Richard Moss, who would have turned it into structure immediately, building models on top of it until the model replaced the observation. Not to Donna Reyes, who would have understood the political implications faster than the scientific ones and begun managing access accordingly. Not to Nathan Cole, who would have written it down in silence and started building private systems of tracking that no one else would ever see. Instead, she isolated the data into a partition that never touched institutional networks, a habit that had started as caution and become something closer to instinct. Then she left the building later than usual, moving through corridors that felt unchanged but no longer neutral in her perception, as if every surface had become part of a system she was no longer fully allowed to trust. She received messages on the way out. She did not open them. One was from Richard Moss, marked urgent without explanation, the kind of urgency that assumed shared context that no longer existed. Another was from Donna Reyes, unmarked, which meant it had bypassed normal classification entirely, which meant it was already outside procedural containment before it even reached her. She ignored both. The walk home did not feel like avoidance. It felt like maintaining separation between systems that were not yet ready to interact without distortion. The city of Erth continued its normal operation around her, transit systems cycling through routes, people moving through scheduled obligations. Light and noise, distributed in patterns that assumed continuity, would remain stable enough to be taken for granted. By the time Elena reached her apartment, she had already stopped trying to translate the pattern into institutional language inside her own mind, because translation was beginning to feel like distortion rather than clarification. She sat in the kitchen without turning on the lights and let the space remain undefined except for what came in from outside, where the city's ambient glow shaped surfaces without fully revealing them. At one point she spoke aloud, not because she expected response, but because the thought had reached a point where remaining internal was no longer structurally stable. If it is structured, Elena said, her voice quiet in the room, then it is not reacting to us. It is continuing regardless of us. No answer came, and none was expected, but the absence of response still carried weight, because it confirmed that whatever this was, it did not belong to any conversational framework they had been trained to rely on. The decision not to inform the others did not arrive as a single ethical moment. It accumulated through observation. Richard Moss becoming increasingly absorbed in reconstruction rather than interpretation, speaking more often to his models than to people. Donna Reyes shifting toward compressed communication that treated information as something to be managed, rather than shared. Nathan Cole quietly documenting inconsistencies without announcing their existence, as if recording them privately might preserve stability longer than exposing them would. Elena Vasquez watched all of it and did not intervene, not because she failed to understand the direction things were moving, but because understanding had already stopped being sufficient to determine whether intervention would preserve anything recognizable on the other side of it. Above Erth, Beyond every instrument designed to reassure human perception of continuity, the stars continued to disappear in sequence, steady and deliberate, as if whatever governed the pattern had already accounted for observation and no longer required acknowledgement to proceed. Richard Moss worked across 3 screens at once, not because it was a habit he particularly thought about anymore, but because the scale of the work had long since exceeded anything that could be meaningfully contained in a single stream of attention, without losing something essential in translation. The left screen carried the raw observational feed from the Valdris telescope arrays, a constant, indifferent update of extinction logs and positional confirmations that accumulated whether or not anyone was actively watching. The center screen held what Richard still referred to as his working model, even though the structure had grown into something closer to an ecosystem of interdependent assumptions, constantly adjusting itself as new data forced rebalancing across layers. He no longer fully separated in his mind. The right screen held literature and counterliterature, older theoretical frameworks, and discarded anomaly reports that he had begun revisiting not because he believed they were correct, but because he had stopped trusting the completeness of anything that had been rejected too easily by earlier consensus. When Richard finally spoke, it was without looking away from the center screen, as though conversation itself had become something that needed to remain peripheral to the integrity of the model. The variance stabilizes when you increase resolution thresholds beyond the institutional baseline, he said, his voice steady in the way it always became when he was close to something he believed could be made to yield. That should not happen if we are dealing with stochastic laws. Nathan Cole, who had been standing slightly behind him, and to the left in the space that allowed simultaneous visibility of both the data feed and Richard's parameter adjustments, answered after a short delay, without fully committing his attention away from his own tablet, where he had been quietly rerunning segments of the same dataset using adjusted weighting assumptions that he had not yet shared with anyone. It doesn't diverge the way noise should, Nathan said. It collapses into the same spacing pattern every time. Richard's hand moved across the center interface, adjusting a parameter without breaking rhythm. Then it is not noise. From the far side of RC7, Donna Reyes spoke without turning from the stack of physical reports she had placed on the central table earlier, her tone carrying the kind of controlled pressure that came from having already absorbed information she did not consider safe to distribute freely through normal channels. The Seven Bloc Council is asking for a classification summary, she said, not looking at either of them directly as she spoke. They want language that can be released publicly, without destabilizing regional coordination structures. Richard's response came without hesitation, still anchored in the screens rather than the row. They will receive language that preserves their internal stability, he said, as if that were a separate category from scientific description rather than something entangled with it. That is not the same thing as explanation. It becomes the same thing when they control what gets interpreted as valid data, Donna replied, finally looking up just long enough to make the point land before returning her attention to the documents, as though they required containment through physical proximity. Nathan shifted his weight slightly, glancing between the screens in the room as if tracking multiple versions of the same problem unfolding in parallel. They already think it's infrastructure failure, he said quietly. Not physics. Not causality. They're not asking what it is. They're asking how to label it so it doesn't spread. Richard paused for the first time in several minutes, not because he had been interrupted in any meaningful way, but because the model had reached a recalibration boundary that required attention before continuation. That distinction is temporary, he said. Once the distribution completes further cycles, classification will follow naturally. Elena Vasquez had not moved from the window during any of this. The light from the city below continued to filter into RC, in muted layers, reflecting faintly off the edges of the screens and giving the room a sense of depth that did not belong entirely to any one perspective. She had been watching Richard long enough to recognize that what he called refusal was not denial in the ordinary sense, but a commitment to preserving a framework of causality, even as the data was steadily eroding the assumptions that made that framework functional. When she finally spoke, it was without turning fully toward the room, as though her attention remained partially anchored outside it. You are still treating this as something that will resolve into explanation if pushed far enough, she said. Nothing in the behavior of the system supports that assumption anymore. Richard did not look at her immediately, though his hands paused briefly on the interface, as if the statement had registered at a deeper layer than the conversational surface. It has not been pushed far enough, he said. Donna let out a quiet breath that carried more fatigue than disagreement, and for a moment the room held only the sound of the system feeds and the subtle mechanical presence of computation, continuing without regard for interpretation. Nathan, after a pause that felt longer than the others, said, "At some point, increasing resolution stops being the same thing as approaching truth." Richard did not respond to that directly. Instead, he returned fully to the model as another extinction event registered on the left screen with the same measured spacing as all the others, indifferent to the conversation happening around it, continuing its sequence with the same deliberate regularity that had defined every previous disappearance. And none of them stopped it, because none of them yet agreed on what it meant that nothing about the pattern required their agreement in order to continue. Donna Reyes opened the classified folder at 9:15, because leaving it untouched had crossed the line from caution into negligence. And in her position, negligence had a habit of becoming retrospective responsibility, the moment someone higher up decided a record needed a narrative explanation. It had been placed on the central table without context, without accompanying message, and without the usual procedural metadata that would normally explain why something had bypassed digital channels entirely in a system that was otherwise saturated with them. That absence of explanation was, in itself, an explanation. She did not sit down while reading it. Sitting would have implied that the contents were something she could afford to engage with at normal processing speed, and nothing about the formatting or classification level suggested that was true. Nathan Cole watched her face instead of the folder. He had learned that documents like this revealed less than the person reading them, because institutional language was designed to flatten emotional response into procedural neutrality, while human reaction still leaked around the edges in ways that could be tracked if you paid close attention. He tracked it. Slight delay before eye movement. Yaw tightening that did not match the cadence of reading speed. A brief pause on page transitions that suggested either disbelief or forced recalibration. Richard Moss did not turn fully away from his screens, but the motion of his hand slowed until the model on the center display stopped updating for several seconds. That was rare. Richard did not usually allow external input to interrupt computational flow, unless the input forced a structural contradiction in what he was building. Elena Vasquez remained by the window, but her attention was no longer divided evenly between outside and inside. It had shifted into something more layered, where the external world and internal interpretation were no longer cleanly separable. The city below continued its morning movement, but she was no longer reading it as neutral background activity. Donna closed the folder. There were incidents overnight, she said. Nathan did not ask what kind of incidents. That would have implied there was still a stable category system for separating events into manageable types, and the tone of her voice made it clear that system had already degraded. How many, he asked instead. Significant enough that classification is no longer meaningful at local reporting level, Donna said, then corrected herself slightly, not because she was uncertain, but because precision mattered in reports that would later be dissected by people who had not been present when the information was first received. She crossed to the wall interface and activated the secured feed. The room shifted into shared display mode, and the atmosphere changed immediately in a way that was not about sound or light, but about attention. Everyone in RC7 stopped operating independently for a moment and became synchronized to the same input stream. The first feed was Seven Bloc. The governmental district was burning in multiple locations that were too separated to be explained as a single ignition event. Smoke rose in layered columns that suggested sustained combustion, rather than isolated structural failure. Emergency response vehicles were visible but not coordinated in any meaningful way, and in several frames, they appeared to be redirecting away from central zones rather than toward them. The camera feed did not stabilize on any one area for long enough to establish full situational clarity, cycling between aerial overview and ground-level fragments as if the system itself could not decide what constituted relevant focus. Nathan stepped forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "That's coordinated pressure on infrastructure nodes," he said. "That's not random civil collapse." Donna did not respond. She was already switching feeds. Ketrick Federation appeared next. A transit hub filled beyond capacity, not in the controlled sense of overcrowding, but in the way systems behave when population movement stops responding to infrastructure guidance entirely. People were not moving in patterns that corresponded to transit logic anymore. They were moving in response to pressure gradients within the crowd itself. A figure stood elevated in the central concourse addressing them, but the audio feed fractured repeatedly, making speech fragments unstable and non-reconstructible. Richard had turned fully from his screens now, though he still had not spoken. His focus was on the feed, not because it was emotionally impactful, but because it introduced variables that were not present in his current model structure. Elena's reflection in the window aligned with the external feed in a way that made it look as though she was simultaneously observing both spaces, though she had not moved. The system cycled again. Aldermere Coast showed mass movement along infrastructure corridors that were no longer functioning as regulated transit routes, but as uncontrolled evacuation channels. Prisca Interior showed communication centers surrounded by dense population clusters that were no longer dispersing. Young Collective appeared next. Nathan paused. "That designation shouldn't be on this list," he said. Yun hasn't had internal destabilization events in recorded cycle history. Donna answered without looking at him. "It does now." The feed continued cycling without waiting for interpretation. Each location followed the same structural pattern despite differences in geography, governance, and infrastructure design. Central systems losing control of peripheral behavior. Communication breaking into fragmented loops. Population movement shifting from organized to reactive, without clear triggering point that could be isolated as singular cause. It was not identical in form, but it was identical in progression. Donna stopped the feed. The room did not return to its previous state afterward. It remained in a condition where input had ceased but processing had not resolved, and none of them spoke immediately, because each of them was now running incompatible interpretations of the same dataset without any shared framework for reconciling them. Nathan finally broke first. "They know," he said. Richard did not respond. His attention had returned to his screens, but the model was no longer updating at previous resolution intervals. His hands rested near the controls without engaging them, as if the system no longer offered him meaningful directions for adjustment that would preserve internal consistency. Elena finally turned away from the window. She did not look at the feed residue, or the documents, or any of them for long. Her attention moved across the room in a way that suggested she was no longer treating any single input source as primary. "This is not separate events," she said. Donna returned the folder to the table, aligning it carefully as if physical order still had relevance in a system where informational order was already collapsing into something less structured. Outside RC7, the city continued operating under morning conditions, but the behavior of people visible through the glass had begun to change in ways that were not yet large enough to be labeled as disruption, only as deviation from expected motion patterns. And none of them said anything further, because at that point there was no longer agreement on whether what they had just seen was information, warning, or confirmation of something that had already moved past the need for acknowledgement. The message had been sitting in Donna Ray's classified archive for 6 weeks, 3 days, and 14 hours when she reached the point where she could no longer treat it as just another item moving through institutional processing channels, not because anything about it had changed in form or content, but because the mental framework she had always relied on for containing classified material had begun to fail in a way that no longer responded to procedural discipline or familiar professional distance. And that failure had accumulated so gradually through repeated contact with the same unchanging text that she only recognized its full extent after it had already become irreversible. Donna Reyes had spent 14 years as Senior Communications Officer, classification grade 4 at the Valdris Observatory Collective, and in that time, Her work had always depended on a single underlying assumption that information existed within a stable external reality that would continue to function in a predictable way after the information was released into it. Which meant her job was not to judge whether something was true in an absolute sense, but to determine how that truth could be translated into institutional language without destabilizing the systems that depended on controlled interpretation. And that process had always felt reliable enough that she had never needed to examine the assumption beneath it. The full decode had arrived on a morning that carried no indication of deviation from routine, with Nathan Cole already preparing coffee in the common area in the same precise and quiet manner that made his actions feel less like habit and more like maintenance of an environment he assumed would remain consistent. While Richard Moss was already seated at his screens in a state of sustained focus that made it unclear whether he was actively interpreting data or simply maintaining continuity with a model that had begun to occupy more cognitive space than the external room itself. And Elena Vasquez was already positioned at the window in the same fixed orientation she had maintained for months without visible variation. While Donna herself had been working through classification backlog in her office when the secure terminal flagged a priority transmission from the Valdris computational array, which had been running uninterrupted pattern analysis across stellar extinction intervals for 11 weeks without pause or deviation. She opened the file immediately because the priority classification required direct review under institutional protocol, and what she encountered did not behave like incomplete analysis or probabilistic interpretation, but instead presented itself as a fully stabilized structural output in which all relevant variants had already been resolved into a consistent sequence that left very little interpretive space between observation and conclusion, forcing an immediate recognition that the extinction interval were no longer behaving like independent anomalies within a natural system, but were instead functioning as ordered elements within a pattern that maintained consistency across conditions that should have produced divergence. Donna read it once without moving, not because she failed to understand what she was seeing, but because understanding it created an immediate pressure toward procedural action that no longer mapped cleanly onto any available institutional response. And when she read it again, her intent had shifted from comprehension to verification, as if additional exposure might introduce instability into the structure that would allow it to be reassigned to category that could be handled through existing classification frameworks, even though she was already aware at some level that the structure was not behaving like anything those frameworks had been designed to accommodate. By the time she reached the end of the decode again, nothing within it had changed, and that unchanging stability forced a collapse in the distinction between interpretation and recognition, because the material did not present itself as a set of claims requiring validation, but as a completed structure that remained internally consistent without requiring external confirmation. And the final translated line identified the extinction sequence as an intentional pattern of transmission, originating outside the observed system, and expressed in terms that removed any remaining metaphorical flexibility, replacing it with a direct equivalence that positioned the sequence itself as communicative structure rather than physical phenomenon. Donna closed the file and remained seated with her hands resting on the desk, without immediately transitioning into any procedural response. Not because she was uncertain what to do next in a practical sense, but because every available classification pathway she had ever used assumed that the world described by information would remain stable after that information was released, and that assumption no longer functioned in any reliable or operational way that she could access. Nathan Cole noticed the change in her stillness before anyone else spoke, not because it was dramatic, but because it deviated from the normal cadence of her decision cycles. And after a moment he addressed her without turning fully away from the room, his voice remaining controlled but carrying a level of attention that had begun to shift from routine observation into concern. "You've been holding that file longer than anything I've ever seen you hold," Nathan said in a tone that suggested neither accusation nor impatience, but an attempt to understand the delay as something meaningful rather than procedural. Donna did not respond immediately because she was still processing the gap between classification procedure and structural recognition, and when she finally spoke, her voice no longer carried the certainty of institutional framing. "It doesn't belong to any category we have," Donna said, not as conclusion but as description of a limitation she was no longer confident could be resolved through refinement of existing systems. Richard Moss did not look away from his screens when he responded, his voice arriving with the same controlled precision he used when working through model construction, as if the room itself was secondary to the structure he was maintaining. Everything belongs to a category if the category is defined correctly, Richard said, continuing to adjust parameters as he spoke, reinforcing his position through sustained engagement with his model rather than through interruption of it. Donna turned her attention fully toward him for the first time since opening the file, her focus no longer distributed across tasks, but fixed on the logic underlying his response. That assumes the system you're categorizing inside of is still stable, Donna said, her tone remaining measured but carrying an increasing awareness that stability itself might no longer be a valid assumption. Richard paused long enough for the center screen to stop updating, the absence of movement emphasizing the rigidity of his attention rather than breaking it, before he replied without turning fully away from his work. The system hasn't changed, Richard said, as if continuity of computation was sufficient evidence of continuity of reality. Elena Vasquez spoke from the window without fully turning back into the room, her voice entering the space in a way that suggested she had been following the exchange without needing to shift her physical position to do so. That depends on what you think the system actually is, Elena said, not as disagreement but as reframing of the assumption underlying both positions. Nathan looked between them as the conversation shifted away from data and toward structural interpretation, his attention tracking the point where informational disagreement became something closer to foundational uncertainty about shared reference. What did it actually say? Nathan asked, not repeating the institutional framing or technical classification language, but asking for the underlying conclusion in its most direct form. Donna hesitated briefly, not because she was uncertain of the content, but because articulating it aloud felt like committing it to a shared reality that would no longer allow it to remain contained within internal processing boundaries. It said the extinction sequence is not random, Donna said, choosing phrasing that remained as close as possible to the structural output she had read. And it is not behaving like a natural system in the way we have been describing it, and it is consistent enough across all observed intervals that it functions like an ordered sequence rather than independent events. Richard finally turned slightly away from his screens, not fully disengaging from them, but allowing part of his attention to enter the room for the first time since the discussion began. That is still interpretation, Richard said, maintaining the distinction between observation and conclusion, as if it were structurally necessary to preserve analytical integrity. Donna shook her head once, not sharply, but with the kind of restrained rejection that suggested the limitation was no longer intellectual but structural. No, Donna said, it's what remains when every other way of interpreting it stops working. The room held in silence for a moment that was not empty, but densely occupied by competing internal models that no longer aligned cleanly with each other. And Elena finally turned away from the window enough to acknowledge the group without fully abandoning her position between interior space and external observation. If that's true, Elena said, her tone remaining controlled but carrying the weight of a conclusion she had not yet fully committed to, then every decision we've made about how to communicate it has already been based on assumptions that no longer apply. No one responded immediately, not because the statement was unclear, but because it required acknowledging that the framework they were operating within might no longer correspond to the conditions they were attempting to describe, and that kind of recognition did not resolve cleanly into immediate action without first destabilizing the assumptions that made coordinated action possible. Donna looked at the sealed folder on the table again, then at the others in the room, and when she spoke again her voice no longer carried institutional certainty in any recognizable form. I've already sent it, Donna said. Nathan's posture changed in a way that registered immediate recalibration of expectation. Richard stopped adjusting his model entirely for the first time since the conversation began, and Elena remained still for a moment longer before speaking, her question arriving quietly but carrying a shift in scale that altered the entire room. To who? Elena asked. Donna did not answer immediately, because the answer had already moved beyond the boundaries of the room in ways that could no longer be contained by delayed acknowledgement, and for the first time since the message had been opened, no one in RC7 attempted to reverse or correct what had already begun moving outside their control. It took 43 minutes for the message to move from controlled secondary circulation into a state where containment was no longer a meaningful operational concept. And Donna Reyes had arrived at that estimate through a working understanding of how information pressure behaves in systems that are already structurally unstable, not as prediction in the abstract sense, but as extrapolation from previous cascade failures she had processed over her career. Though she did not experience any satisfaction in being correct, because correctness at that stage had stopped functioning as control, and instead read as confirmation that institutional buffering layers were failing exactly as expected once external pressure exceeded design assumptions. Nathan Cole noticed the shift first because he was already monitoring the secondary feeds alongside the institutional channels, tracking the lower-tier networks where unfiltered public interpretation always emerged before being shaped or suppressed. And what he observed was not a single breach event, but a progressive synchronization across fragmented nodes that had previously been held apart by filtering systems that were now losing coherence in real time, and to the point where he finally said, without looking away from his screen, "It's out." And the statement carried no emotional framing because he was no longer processing it as news, but as structural confirmation that containment had already failed across multiple layers of distribution. For several seconds, no one responded because the meaning of what Nathan had said required redefinition of what out, even referred to, in a system where separation between institutional release, secondary circulation, and public propagation had effectively dissolved. And Elena Vasquez remained at the window while Nathan watched her reflection instead of her directly, noting a shift that was not visible in posture or expression, but in the way stillness itself had begun to behave differently. As if internal processing had adjusted to accommodate external conditions that were no longer stable or optional to acknowledge. Richard Moss turned away from his screens more slowly than Nathan had ever seen him move in the entire time he had worked with him, and that delay was immediately registered, because Richard's baseline operational mode was rapid iteration across multiple model layers, so any reduction in velocity indicated not uncertainty, but resistance against accepting input that could no longer be absorbed into existing analytical structures without forcing model collapse. And Richard said, "Where did it propagate first?" while still looking at his data stream, as if origin tracking still held meaning in a system where propagation had already eliminated sequential boundaries. Nathan answered without breaking his monitoring cycle, saying, "Secondary aggregation networks first, then mid-tier filters, then everything that was supposed to hold it back just stopped functioning as a barrier, and after that the primary feeds didn't even delay it, they just collapsed under it." And Richard read his own screen for several seconds before responding. "That's not a leak pattern, that's full saturation across the communication lattice," which he said in a tone that suggested recognition of a model failure, rather than disagreement with the data itself. Donna remained at the central table, where the sealed folder still sat physically present even though its contents had already been replicated across systems beyond institutional control, and Nathan looked at her and said, "You expected this timing," not as accusation, but as attempt to determine whether the propagation rate had been structurally predictable or whether they were already beyond any meaningful predictive framework. And Donna answered after a moment without looking up, "I expected the network to fail faster than the institutions," then added, "I didn't expect it to feel like it was happening all at once everywhere." Lena finally turned slightly away from the window and said, "Show me what they're seeing now." Not as request, but as requirement for situational alignment. And Nathan rotated his secondary display so the live feed became visible to the room, where the verified decode was already circulating across multiple platforms simultaneously, with validation signatures attached from the Valdris computational array. And Richard leaned in closer, as if physical proximity to the data might still influence interpretability, saying, "That signature verifies as authentic," in a tone that carried recognition of technical confirmation rather than doubt or interpretation. The message itself remained structurally brief, which made it more resistant to controlled framing because it could not be meaningfully paraphrased without immediately revealing its original form, and Nathan read it aloud as it appeared across the feeds without intending to formalize it, saying, "Simulation terminated. Process concluded. All instances will cease." after which he stopped speaking because vocalization changed the experience of the statement from observation into participation in its propagation, and that distinction became increasingly difficult to ignore. Lena did not respond immediately, and when she did, it was directed not at the wording itself but at its functional implication within the system, saying, "That's not communication anymore, that's declaration," while Richard shook his head once and responded, "No, that's not declaration either, that's system-level output without interpretive layer." And Donna finally spoke from the table without moving toward the screen, saying, "It doesn't matter what category we assign to it. It's already being treated as real everywhere it's reached," which Nathan could confirm by watching the simultaneous escalation across secondary and primary channels, converging into a single unified propagation state. Nathan said, "How far has it gone beyond controlled networks?" And Donna answered, "Far enough that there is no functional difference anymore between controlled and uncontrolled," which caused Richard to stop interacting with his screens entirely for the first time since the feed began accelerating, standing up in a motion that lacked his usual precision, and moving toward the window where Elena was positioned. Richard said, "None of my models account for this state transition," and Elena replied without turning fully toward him, "Then your models assumed a stability that wasn't real," while Nathan continued tracking the feed expansion as it now moved through populations that were no longer distinguishing between institutional messaging and public interpretation, because both had collapsed into the same simultaneous exposure event. Richard asked, "What does terminated mean in a system that is still actively processing input?" And Elena answered, "It means the assumption of continuation was incorrect," while Nathan added, "It means people are going to interpret it faster than we can define it, because the propagation was already shifting from informational to behavioral across multiple regions in real time." Donna stood from the table slowly, still not touching the folder, and said, "I try to keep it controlled through release structure," and Richard replied immediately, "Controlled release structure stopped applying the moment it left institutional channels," while Elena added, "It stopped applying the moment it left any single point of interpretation, and no one corrected her because correction required a stable framework that was no longer available." Outside the window, the city remained visually continuous, buildings and streets maintaining ordinary motion patterns that no longer matched the informational systems describing them, while inside RC7, every active feed was now displaying the same verified message across collapsing communication layers that had ceased to behave as independent systems. And Nathan finally said, "We are no longer inside the phase where this can be contained or reversed." And the room did not respond, because at that point, response itself required assumptions about control that none of them could still fully access. Nathan Cole first understood that something had changed in the Fishbowl, not through any announcement or visible break in procedure, but through the gradual and almost imperceptible redistribution of responsibility that no one had agreed to, and no one could later pinpoint the origin of. It had begun as small omissions that were too minor to escalate. Richard Moss not attending a morning sync, Elena Vasquez leaving her workstation without logging her departure time, Donna Reyes failing to return a confirmation on a classification update, and it had accumulated into a structural condition, where Nathan was simply the person who ensured that none of those omissions became visible enough to force the system to acknowledge them. The Valdris Observatory Collective still functioned on paper with its usual hierarchy intact, but inside RC7, that hierarchy had started behaving like a suggestion rather than a framework. Nathan had noticed it most clearly the morning after the decode went public, when he arrived early and found the room already in a kind of anticipatory stillness, as if it had been occupied overnight by people who had not bothered to leave traces of their presence. He had made coffee without asking who wanted it, opened all the standard feeds, and reconstructed the missing overnight summary from fragmented logs and partial system pings, not because anyone had instructed him to, but because the absence of it would have created a gap the room could not tolerate. Elena was already at the window when he finished booting his terminal. She did not turn as he entered, and Nathan did not expect her to. Over the past weeks, her position in the room had become less like a habitual location and more like a fixed observational state, as though the city outside had become the only stable dataset still worth continuous monitoring. "You adjusted the feed waiting again," Elena said without looking back. Nathan checked his screen before answering, confirming what she had already observed. Global response clusters were saturating the primary channel, It was distorting signal clarity. It wasn't distortion, Elena replied. It was reality catching up. Nathan paused long enough to register the implication without endorsing it. We still need usable input, he said carefully. Elena finally turned her head slightly, just enough for Nathan to see her reflection in the glass rather than her face directly. Usable for what? The question landed in a way that made Nathan briefly stop interacting with his console. It was not hostile, but it removed the assumption underneath every operational action he had taken for the last several weeks. He did not answer immediately, and the delay itself became part of the exchange. Richard Moss entered the room, while Nathan was still choosing a response. The timing was inconsistent with Richard's established routine, and that inconsistency alone shifted Nathan's attention fully onto him. Richard did not immediately approach his workstation. Instead, he stood near the entrance, as if confirming that the room still existed in a configuration he recognized. Nathan spoke first. You're off cycle again. Richard's eyes moved across the room, before settling briefly on Nathan. Cycle assumes continuity, he said. That assumption is no longer reliable. Elena returned fully from the window now, stepping away from it for the first time since Nathan arrived. That's a convenient conclusion, she said, for someone whose entire work depends on continuity. Richard gave a small, restrained exhale that was closer to fatigue than disagreement. My work depends on patterns, he replied. Patterns are still present. Nathan brought the shared display forward between them, pulling updated global feeds into a single aggregated view. The system populated slowly, as if even the infrastructure was beginning to lose confidence in its own throughput. Patterns are changing shape, Nathan said. The distribution curves aren't stabilizing anymore. Richard looked at the display, but did not engage with it immediately. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier precision. They were never stabilizing, he said. We were only observing intervals between disruptions and assuming that meant structure. Elena crossed the room slightly, not fully leaving the window behind but no longer anchored to it. You're still trying to translate it into something the models can tolerate, she said. Richard met her gaze. That's what models are for. No, Elena replied quietly. That's what they were for. The distinction was not elaborated on, but it altered the atmosphere in the room in a way Nathan could measure more easily than he could articulate. He had seen systems degrade before, but this was not degradation in the conventional sense. It was the gradual loss of agreement about what constituted a valid reference point. Nathan checked incoming verification, logs out of habit more than necessity. The Valdris network was still producing data, still running comparative analysis against historical stellar behavior sets, but the outputs were beginning to show a subtle divergence from interpretability thresholds. He did not say this aloud yet. He was still maintaining the boundary between observation and implication. Richard finally sat down at the edge of his workstation, rather than engaging it directly. Donna has not returned any institutional confirmation, he said. Nathan answered without looking away from his screen. She won't. That's not confirmed, Richard said. It is, Elena replied before Nathan could. Just not in the way you're still trying to define confirmation. Richard looked down briefly, then back up. If institutional channels are no longer reliable, he said, then we are operating without verification structure. Nathan finally spoke more directly. We've been operating without stable verification structure since the second extinction event, he said. We just didn't name it that way at the time. Richard leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. And now, he asked, we are naming it correctly. Elena answered first. Now we're acknowledging that naming it doesn't restore control. That statement remained unchallenged, not because it was agreed upon, but because it introduced a level of consequence that none of them could immediately counter with procedure. Nathan shifted focus back to the global feeds. The secondary networks were now outpacing institutional channels entirely. Civil responses were no longer distinguishable from interpretive frameworks. Entire regions were reorganizing behaviorally around their own readings of the decoded message, which meant there was no longer a single informational reality being managed, only multiple concurrent interpretations of collapse. Richard watched the data for a long moment before speaking again. If we remove assumption of physical causality, he said slowly, then none of this belongs to a solvable system. Elena did not look at him when she answered. It never required solving, she said. It required recognizing. Nathan kept his attention on the feeds, but the room itself had become the primary system he was tracking. The shifts between them were no longer purely intellectual. They were behavioral, emotional, structural. Each person in RC7 was now operating under a different internal model of what the same information meant, and Nathan was beginning to understand that his role was no longer coordination, but containment. He continued working anyway. Richard stopped trying to reconcile outputs with prior models. Elena returned to the window again, not as retreat, but as if the external world remained the only remaining reference that had not yet fully collapsed into interpretation. And Nathan Cole, without ever being told he would be the one to do it, kept the room functioning long enough that it did not yet fully fall apart. Donna Reyes did not think of it as a kingdom, and when the word began appearing in private channels, and then later in public commentary streams, she initially rejected it with the kind of reflexive irritation she associated with institutional branding exercises, the sort of language that tried to compress complex social behavior into a shape that could be filed, categorized, and ultimately controlled by someone who was not present when it actually formed. What she understood, sitting in the small room above the transit depot in Aldenmere, looking down through a window that had become increasingly irrelevant as more people gathered outside than could reasonably be counted as an audience, was that nothing about what was happening had been designed, including her own participation in it. She had released a message because withholding it had begun to feel like an active form of distortion, and because she had convinced herself, with the kind of precision she used to apply to classification thresholds and dissemination protocols, that the public had a right to the truth in a situation where truth itself had begun to lose its institutional guarantees. Everything after that had been consequence rather than intention. The first people had arrived cautiously, as if approaching something unstable that might collapse or detonate depending on how directly it was acknowledged. They had not come as followers in any meaningful sense, not at first, but as recipients of information that had already begun to alter the internal structure of their assumptions about reality. Donna remembered that first gathering in the Civic Hall in Aldenmere, not as a moment of leadership, but as a moment of exposure, as if she had been placed under a light that she could no longer step away from without disappearing entirely. She had stood at the front of the room without amplification at first, because the room had been quiet enough that she had believed she would not need it, and she had introduced herself in the most direct terms she could manage. I worked at the Valdris Observatory Collective, she had said, and her voice had carried farther than she expected because of the density of attention in the space, because every person there was holding their breath in a way that made sound travel differently. I had access to the decoded transmission for 6 weeks before it was released. I released it because I did not believe there was any remaining justification for containment. A man in the third row had asked her, after a long silence that had felt like something structural settling, whether she believed it was real in the way people were saying it was real online, whether the phrase simulation termination was metaphor or literal classification. Donna had looked at him for a long moment before answering, not because she was uncertain, but because she was aware that whatever she said next would begin to define the boundaries of something that would continue without her permission. It is not metaphor, she had said. But it is also not something that fits cleanly into the categories you are used to using to decide what metaphor even means. That had been the first fracture point, she thought later. The moment when the audience stopped being an audience and began becoming something else, something that was not yet organized but was already self-reinforcing. Now, weeks later, the room above the transit depot had become a kind of rotating center of gravity for that something. People came and left continuously, not in crowds so much as in currents, as if drawn by pressure differentials in information rather than by invitation or ideology. Donna no longer managed the flow in any formal sense. She had tried at first, out of habit more than necessity, to structure conversations, to prevent overload, to preserve accuracy in the transmission of what she knew versus what she speculated versus what she explicitly did not know. That distinction had lasted approximately 4 days. After that, the system began to manage itself in ways she had not anticipated. There were people now who handled scheduling without being asked. People who filtered questions before they reached her. People who had begun, without formal designation, to summarize her statements into distributed formats that could be carried outward into other networks. She had objected once sharply, when she realized a phrasing attributed to her had been subtly altered into something more definitive than she would have said. "That's not what I said," she had told the woman who had produced the summary sheet, a former logistics coordinator whose name Donna only learned after the conversation had already ended. The woman had not been defensive. "It is what people were able to take from what you said," she replied. "If you want precision preserved, you have to accept that it will slow down transmission to the point where it no longer functions as transmission." Donna had stood with the paper in her hand for a long time after that, realizing that she was no longer operating within a system that prioritized her original constraints. In the evenings, when the flow of people thinned, she would sit by the window and watch the transit depot square fill and empty in cycles that no longer corresponded to any formal schedule. The sky above Aldenmere was increasingly unreliable in the way it presented itself, not because anything about the atmosphere had changed, but because attention had. There were fewer stars now visible above the city's light wash, and the absence had begun to feel less like subtraction and more like structure, as if something was being actively removed according to a logic that no longer required explanation. She thought often of the fishbowl. Not in abstract terms, but in the specific sensory reconstruction of it. The filtered institutional air, the hum of redundant systems, Elena standing at the window with that unbearable stillness, Richard's screens layered across his field of vision like competing realities, Nathan's quiet efficiency, the way he had always been the one making sure the system did not collapse under its own internal contradictions. Nathan came back into her thoughts more than she would have liked to admit, and never in the clean emotional categories she would have preferred. It was not nostalgia. It was not regret. It was recognition of a continuity that had been severed without clean edges. She had not contacted him. That fact had become its own kind of structure inside her thinking, revisited often enough that it had ceased to be a decision, and had become instead a condition. Outside, the movement had begun to formalize in ways she had not directed, but could no longer plausibly describe as external to her influence. There were names now being used, though she resisted them whenever they were presented to her. There were schedules. There were regional coordinations. There were disagreements that required mediation, and mediators who were not her. The word kingdom returned again, more insistently now, in feeds and commentary threads and external analyses attempting to make sense of the emergent structure. Donna had said, in one of the early assemblies, when someone used the word leadership directly to her face, "I am not leading anything. I am telling you what I know. What you're building around that is yours, not mine." A younger man had responded, without hostility but with certainty. "That's not how it works once people start listening at scale." She had not had an answer to that in the moment that satisfied her. Now she understood it differently. Listening at scale was not passive. It was transformative. It reorganized the speaker, regardless of intent. In private, she sometimes tested the edges of that transformation by returning to the original decode, still stored in secure memory, still unchanged, still carrying the same precise institutional verification signature that had made it impossible to dismiss. Simulation terminated. Process concluded. All instances will cease. She would read it and feel the same quiet coldness she had felt when she first saw it. Not fear exactly, but a removal of assumptions so complete that what remained underneath it could not be immediately named. The question that now occupied her more than any other was not whether it was true. That question had been answered, at least in the functional sense that mattered for behavior. The question was what it meant to act inside a truth that did not provide any guidance for action. A knock came at the doorframe behind her one evening when the room had thinned again, and the depot outside was settling into its lower cycle of movement. One of the coordinators stepped in without fully entering, waiting for acknowledgement rather than permission. "There's a transmission request from Valdris," she said. Donna did not turn immediately. Which channel? Secure institutional, the coordinator replied. They're not using public infrastructure. That detail mattered. It meant this was not outreach. It was not mediation. It was containment or verification, or something adjacent to both. Donna exhaled slowly and finally turned from the window. Who from Valdris? She asked. The coordinator hesitated just long enough to signal that the answer was not routine. Nathan Cole, she said. Donna felt the name land with a kind of quiet structural impact that did not translate into immediate action. For a moment, she did not respond, and in that moment she became aware of how much of her current existence had been built around the accents of certain conversations. Then she nodded once. Root it, she said. The coordinator left. Donna remained standing for a long time before the terminal activated. When it finally did, and Nathan's presence resolved into a live channel connection, the first thing she noticed was not what he said, but how carefully he was holding himself inside the frame of the transmission, as if even here, even now, he was still performing the function of being the one who holds. Donna, Nathan said. Hello, Nathan, she replied, and there was a pause that contained too many things neither of them immediately attempted to unpack. Then Nathan said, very carefully, we are trying to understand what your network is becoming. Donna almost smiled at that phrasing, not because it was inaccurate, but because it was still attempting to treat emergent reality as something that could be understood from the outside. It's not mine, she said. Nathan held her gaze. It is around you, he replied. That's not the same thing as ownership, but it's not unrelated either. Donna looked past him for a moment, as if checking the structural integrity of that statement against the world she could see through her window. Outside, the sky had already begun its slow correction again, the absence pattern unchanged, and she registered without emphasis that there were still 31 stars left, as there had been the night before, and as there would continue to be until that number stopped being stable. I know, she said finally. I stopped trying to correct that a while ago. Nathan nodded slightly, as if that answer confirmed something he had already been calculating. And for the first time since the decode had gone public, Donna had the distinct and unsettling sense that whatever was forming here was no longer simply reacting to the message. It was beginning to respond to the accents of the world that had existed before it. It came back on a Tuesday, though the calendar distinction itself had already begun to lose its practical usefulness inside the Fishbowl, where time had gradually shifted away from behaving like a structured sequence of discrete, labeled intervals, and instead began to feel more like a continuous and slightly compressing field of ongoing events that arrived when they were ready to arrive rather than when any external system suggested they should. And Elena only registered the Tuesdayness of it afterward, when she found herself trying, without full conscious intent, to attach the memory of his arrival to something stable enough that it would not dissolve into the surrounding accumulation of indistinguishable working hours that had begun to define the room. She saw Richard enter through the main door at a point in the day that could not meaningfully be categorized as either early or late under any of the operational assumptions they had once relied on without question, and she did not react in any visible way, because visible reaction had become something that required a level of internal surplus none of them were consistently maintaining anymore. A kind of emotional margin that had slowly been eroded by repeated exposure to information that no longer arrived in manageable portions, and Richard Moss moved into the room with the appearance of someone who had spent an extended period outside of any shared interpretive environment, and was still in the process of determining whether re-entry was possible at all. His clothing still resembled the version of him they remembered, but the alignment between body and garment had shifted in a way that suggested prolonged absence from ordinary maintenance, as though the physical structure underneath had been operating under conditions that no longer prioritized external coherence. And Nathan, already at his station, registered the arrival in the way he always did now, which was not as disruption, but as incremental system load. An additional input that would need to be incorporated into whatever fragile continuity they were still managing to sustain. Nathan did not stand. He simply said, Richard, with a level of restraint that acknowledged both presence and change without attempting to resolve either. Richard gave a brief nod that did not fully become acknowledgement in any social sense, and moved further into the room as though testing whether its internal geometry still matched the one he had last successfully navigated, pausing for only a moment near the center before orienting himself toward neither his workstation nor the window, but toward the space between them, where most of the room's unresolved tension had begun to accumulate over time. Elena turned from the window in a slow, continuous motion that suggested the act of shifting attention had become something that required calibration rather than impulse, and she observed him without immediately speaking, allowing the presence of him to fully register before introducing language into it. "You're back," she said eventually, though the phrasing carried none of its usual implication of absence resolved, and functioned more as an acknowledgement of reappearance within a system that had not fully accounted for his departure in the first place. Richard paused as if evaluating the accuracy of the statement in terms that were not strictly linguistic. "I returned to proximity," he said after a moment, "but I am not certain I have returned to alignment." Nathan's hand slowed at his interface, though he did not look up fully, and the room absorbed the phrasing without immediate response, because it did not belong to any of their remaining stable categories of interpretation. Richard moved further in and did not take a station, which itself registered as meaningful to both Elena and Nathan, without either of them needing to articulate why. Because positioning had become one of the few remaining reliable indicators of internal state, in a place where explicit statements had grown increasingly unreliable. "I was not absent in the way absence is normally defined," Richard continued, as though continuing a thought that had remained active throughout his separation from them. "I was engaged in a parallel processing state that was no longer compatible with shared operational framing." Nathan finally looked up. "You mean you stopped participating in the shared model space?" "I mean," Richard said, after a pause that suggested he was selecting language carefully rather than spontaneously, "the shared model space stopped being coherent enough to participate in." Elena did not correct him. Instead, she shifted slightly away from the window, not fully leaving it behind but no longer anchored to it either, and allowed herself to step closer to the center of the room, where both Richard and Nathan were now oriented in ways that no longer resembled their earlier structural hierarchy. "That's been happening gradually," she said. "We've all been compensating differently." Nathan exhaled slowly. "The incoming data hasn't stabilized," he added, as though maintaining procedural framing might still preserve continuity in at least one layer of function. Richard shook his head slightly. "Stabilization assumes there is a system state that precedes disturbance," he said. "What I observed does not support that assumption." Elena regarded him for a long moment. "Then what did you observe?" Richard's answer came more slowly, as though it required him to step outside of internal constraint that had previously organized his thinking. "I observed consistency across outputs that cannot be reconciled with any single underlying generative structure," he said. "Which means either the system is not singular, or our access to it is not complete, or the distinction between system and observer is no longer operationally valid." Nathan leaned back slightly. "That last option isn't testable." "It is not currently testable," Richard corrected, "within the parameters we are still attempting to use." Elena moved a fraction closer to the center, not interrupting the exchange but reshaping her presence within it, and said, "So you're saying your models didn't fail?" Richard looked at her directly now. "They completed," he said. "They reached a state of internal consistency that no longer maps onto external interpretability." Nathan frowned slightly. "That sounds like failure." "It sounds like completion that invalidates the meaning of completion," Richard replied. The room did not immediately respond to that, because it landed in a space none of them were willing to fully occupy yet. Elena eventually said, "Donna didn't wait for that conclusion." At the mention of Donna, the room shifted subtly, not in structure but in attention. Nathan said, "She made it public before you resolved it." Richard corrected him gently, "I had already resolved it. I simply did not accept the resolution as actionable." Elena studied him. "That distinction cost time." "It cost coherence," Richard said, "which is not the same thing as time, though time is where coherence manifests." Nathan looked back to his feed, where global response patterns continued without settling into any single interpretive direction that could be cleanly isolated from others. It's accelerating again, he said. Elena did not turn. It isn't acceleration, she said. It's reduction in filtering layers. Richard stepped slightly closer to the central table, though still not fully engaging with his workstation. That implies the system is not changing its behavior, he said. Only our capacity to interpret it is changing. Nathan nodded once. That's consistent with what we're seeing. Lena added, or we're closer to it now than we were before. That statement remained in the room longer than the others, because it did not belong to any of their usual categories of analysis, and instead functioned as something closer to recognition. Richard finally lowered himself to sit, not at his station, but at the edge of the central table, as though proximity to his tools had become less relevant than proximity to the conversation itself. When I left, he said again, more slowly now, I attempted to isolate a boundary condition, a point at which the model would cease to act on two observable behavior. Nathan looked at him. And you didn't find one. I found that the concept of boundary condition assumes separability between system and observation, Richard said. That assumption does not hold. Elena returned to the window briefly, not as retreat but as orientation, and said, Then what are we inside? Richard answered without hesitation, but the speed of it did not reduce its weight, as though the thought had already been fully formed and was only now crossing into shared language. We are inside a process that is still producing outputs consistent with termination without requiring cessation of structure, he said, and even as he spoke it, the sentence carried the strain of something precise being used past the point it was designed for, still correct, but no longer comfortably contained by the system that defined its correctness. Nathan frowned, not in disagreement but in the slow recognition of something that refused to simplify itself. That sounds like contradiction, he said, the words landing more like a diagnostic observation than a challenge. It is, Richard said immediately and then continued without pause, and it is stable. The word stable did not settle. It lingered in the space between them, not because it resolved anything, but because it failed to behave like a reassurance anymore. It had become a label that no longer pointed to anything they could agree on. Lena turned back from the window fully now, as though that word had finally forced the room to demand attention. Stable doesn't mean survivable, she said, and there was no emphasis in it, only the exhaustion of something she no longer needed to argue for. No, Richard agreed, and his agreement did not soften the point, only clarified it. It only means persistent. Nathan finally spoke again, slower this time, as if checking the shape of what he was about to say against what the system would allow him to observe. Donna is building something around it. Lena did not ask what, because asking would imply there was still a version of the situation that could be contained by explanation alone. Richard did not ask how, because the mechanics had already stopped being the relevant layer. Elena said instead, and Nathan is still holding the systems together. Nathan did not respond immediately. When he did, it was without any of the framing that would have made it sound like a role, rather than an ongoing decision. I am maintaining continuity of intake and reporting functions, he said, and the phrasing felt increasingly like something he was repeating, because there was nothing simpler left that still fit. Richard looked at him for a moment longer than necessary for comprehension. Why, he said. Nathan hesitated, then answered in a way that was less procedural than anything he had said so far. Because nothing else has replaced it yet. Elena nodded slightly, as if that was the only remaining justification that still functioned without requiring additional structure. Outside the window, the city continued its movement through late day without any visible awareness of internal collapse in interpretive frameworks, and the absence of stars continued to increase in a way that no longer required instrumentation to verify, only attention, which most people were still providing whether they wanted to or not. Richard eventually said, "We should assume there will not be a reversal." Elena answered, without turning away from the window this time. "We already are." Nathan added quietly, "We just haven't updated language to match it." And for a long moment after that, none of them spoke, because speech had begun to feel less like a tool for coordination, and more like an artifact of a system that was still running in parallel even as its governing assumptions continued to erode. And in that silence, they remained together in the fishbowl, not resolved, not concluded, but still functioning inside whatever remained of the structure that had once made their roles feel distinct. The last morning came without any kind of announcement that would have distinguished it from the mornings that had preceded it, because by that point, the idea of announcement itself had become meaningless inside the fishbowl, where nothing arrived with ceremony anymore, and everything simply emerged into view as part of an ongoing condition that no longer respected the older separation between ordinary time and significant time. Nathan stood at his apartment window and watched the light arrive in the east in its usual gradual accumulation, a slow lifting of gray into slightly less gray, the sky continuing its ancient process of becoming visible without any regard for what human beings were asking of it or expecting from it. He held his coffee with both hands without urgency and without distraction, and for the first time in days, he did not attempt to organize his thoughts into any kind of list or structure. The habit had fallen away on its own rather than through decision, as if the mind had simply stopped producing the scaffolding it had once relied on to remain stable in the face of accumulating pressure. He had expected that stopping would feel like collapse, but instead it felt like suspension, as though something that had been holding him in place had finally released its grip, and he had not yet fallen in any direction. It was not peace in any clean sense, but it was also not panic. It was something less legible than either, something that existed in the narrow space between sustained function and complete disintegration, and he had not yet decided whether that space was dangerous or simply unfamiliar. He had slept that night, which still surprised him in a way that felt increasingly unreasonable. Sleep had become unreliable for months, and yet continued to return without explanation, as if the body had its own set of priorities that did not align with anything the conscious mind was doing. He had once read that physiological systems tend to preserve rhythm under extreme conditions, even when cognitive systems abandon coherence, and he found himself thinking about that again, without knowing whether it mattered. He finished his coffee and dressed without particular attention to the process. Outside, the sky continued to brighten slowly. 4 stars were still visible, though diminished now in a way that made them feel less like distant objects and more like isolated points that had been left behind by something that had moved on without them. The sun had not yet risen, but it was close enough that the remaining stars no longer held any sense of expansion around them. They were simply present, reduced to their own immediacy. He left his apartment and walked to the Valdris building. Elena was already there. She had been arriving early for days now, earlier than anyone else, as if presence itself had become the only remaining form of continuity that still felt meaningful. She stood at the window in the fishbowl looking down at the city, which had changed in ways that were subtle but cumulative. The streets were still active, people still moving through their routines, but there was a reduction in ambient noise that was difficult to quantify. It was not silence, but it was a kind of thinning, as if the city had begun to withdraw a portion of itself from constant expression. Elena had spoken to her sister the night before, and that conversation remained with her in a way that was unusually stable compared to most recent experiences. Her sister had not engaged with a subject that dominated Elena's working life. She had spoken instead about children, about a meal that had gone wrong in a small, ordinary way, about water pressure in her building that had been inconsistent for months. Elena had understood, in a way that was not intellectual but immediate, that this was not avoidance in the simple sense. It was selection, a deliberate narrowing of focus onto what could still be maintained without collapse. She had told her sister she loved her. Her sister had responded without hesitation, saying that she knew, and that Elena should visit when she could. The conversation had ended there, without further elaboration, and Elena had remained afterward in her apartment for a long time without moving, experiencing something that did not resolve into any familiar emotional category. It was not grief, and it was not comfort. It was something larger than both, something that carried no clear direction but still altered her internal state in a way she could not ignore. Now she stood at the window in the fishbowl and held a cup of coffee that had gone cold without her noticing. Nathan arrived and took his place at his station, without speaking immediately. The routine of the room had begun to feel like the only remaining structure that still operated without negotiation. He set his coffee down and began checking the incoming data streams, which continued to function with the same consistency they had always maintained, even as everything surrounding them had changed in interpretive stability. Elena turned slightly as he arrived. "Good morning," she said. Nathan responded, without looking away from the screen. "Good morning." The simplicity of the exchange felt appropriate in a way that neither of them commented on. There was no need for expansion. The space between them was already occupied by everything they were both tracking without needing to name it. 4 stars remained visible in the sky, though one of them was low enough on the horizon that it would soon disappear from observation. Nathan updated the dashboard with the same precision he had maintained throughout the entire sequence of monitoring, entering the values without embellishment or interpretation. Observation time, coordinates count. The system accepted the input without hesitation. Elena watched the city below for a moment longer, then said quietly, "Richard is not here." Nathan glanced at the absence indicator on his secondary feed. "No," he said. "He is not here." Elena did not ask where he was. The question no longer felt structurally necessary. Richard had been moving further outside the shared space for some time, and whatever direction that movement had taken, it no longer registered as absence in the conventional sense. It registered as divergence. Nathan continued working. Outside the Fishbowl, Donna stood in a public square in the Aldenmere district, though the structure that had once defined itself as a movement had reduced significantly in scale. What had begun as a large and expanding network of people had gradually condensed into something more concentrated, less organizational and more observational. The people who remained were not those seeking instruction or structure. They were those who had chosen proximity to uncertainty rather than distance from it. Donna stood on a raised platform that had been assembled without formal ceremony, and looked out at them without attempting to shape their attention into anything other than what it already was. He had stopped speaking in structured institutional terms days earlier. The language had loosened, not into incoherence, but into directness that no longer attempted to manage interpretation in advance. "I don't know what this is," she said to them at one point, her voice carrying without amplification strain. "I don't know what we are inside. I don't know what it means that this is happening. I only know that it is happening, and that we are here to see it together." There was no immediate response, and she did not expect one. The people listening were not positioned as audience anymore. They were positioned as witnesses, and the distinction mattered in a way she could feel but not fully articulate. She thought again about Nathan and the Fishbowl, and the moment she had sent the message that initiated public release. She had not called him afterward. The absence of that contact had become its own kind of structure, not avoidance but deferred recognition. She took out her communicator and typed a message without pausing to refine it. "I should have called sooner. I am sorry. I hope you are okay. I think you are okay." She sent it without waiting for internal debate to resolve. Above the square, the remaining stars were visible in the early light. 4 points of light that no longer implied expansion or continuation beyond themselves. They were simply what remained. Back in the Fishbowl, Richard was not present. Nathan noted it formally and left it as absence without elaboration. He had stopped attempting to fill missing states with interpretive speculation unless required. The system continued to function regardless of individual presence. The instruments continued to record. The feeds continued to update. Elena returned to her window and stayed there. Nathan continued working at his station, the inputs moving across his screens in steady streams that required no commentary and offered none in return. There was nothing left in the room that needed to be said in order for the systems to keep running, and so nothing was said. And the absence of explanation did not interrupt anything, it simply sat alongside the work as another condition of it. The morning continued forward without any sense of emphasis, without any shift that could be marked as arrival or change, only a gradual persistence of motion that carried itself from one moment into the next because there was no longer any alternative structure competing with it. The light over the city strengthened as the sun rose, and the sky filled in the way it always had, not as an event but as a continuation of visibility that required no acknowledgement to occur. The remaining stars faded one at a time until they were no longer distinguishable against the brightness, and the instruments registered the change without reaction, because they were built only to record and not to respond. 4 stars had been visible in the sky only moments before the light of the rising sun began to take them away. The increasing brightness erased them one by one, until nothing remained of them against the morning sky. Nathan did not look up from his screens as the change happened. Elena did not turn away from the window while it unfolded. Outside, the day kept forming as it always had, and the work kept happening within it without needing to announce that it was continuing. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing so you never miss a story. And if you want to support the show, leaving a review on your favorite podcast app really helps us grow. Hope to see you next time.